We all know, or at least the Inquisition hopes so, that the winds of magic are a little bit like the streams from the Ghostbusters franchise. You can't cross them. Combine them, that is. At least if you're a human. Is that true though? Hi, I'm Werner from the Ratcatcher Tales channel, where we dive deep into the Warhammer fantasy lore. And today we are going to take a closer look on the belief that human mages should not even try to power their spells by multiple winds of magic. What is the source of this belief? Was it practiced in the past? And what is the situation today? Let's start with the Asur, whose mages are undoubtedly able to combine together various winds of magic with unparalleled skill. That is, of course, true, but we cannot forget that they spent decades mastering their control over each wind of magic, so that later on they can begin to train in the art of homogeneous waving of them all. All of that so that they could wield the true or so-called high magic kaish. But humans? Nah, humans are too weak, their lives are too short and their minds too primitive to wield multiple winds simultaneously. Or at least, that's the hard line of the Altdorf's Colleges of Magic. I believe that our reflections should start from that very institution, since its founding was a turning point for magic users in the Empire. Obviously, in the times before them, there existed enclaves of freedom for magic users, such as Middenheim or Salzenmund, and broadly speaking, the North. That said, generally speaking, the Empire of Sigmar was rather hostile towards the witches, wizards or mages, and they were all generally prosecuted. All of that changed when, in the answer to the Empire's call for aid in fight against the forces of chaos, Ulthuan, instead of a vast and powerful armies that were busy elsewhere, sent 3 archmages from Safari, Teclis, Irtil and Finreyr. Once they've arrived in the Old World, they have begun training local magic users so that they could stand against the forces of chaos themselves on the field of battle. Or at least training those that were deemed strong enough to not fall to the influence of chaos right away. Culmination of those efforts was the founding of the Imperial Colleges of Magic in Altdorf, a university of sorts that was meant to mold sanctioned imperial mages. Its creation is, by the way, a story in itself, and I hope to return to this topic someday in an episode devoted entirely to the subject. But what's important for us today is that it's not a university whose goal is to spread the knowledge about magic among the general human population. Nope, it's an institution that is supposed to mold future mages in accordance to the rules and the outline left for it by Teclis and Censores. Even today, after over 200 years after its founding, in the Tower of Volans, one can find consultants from Ulthuan who make sure that the human mages don't accidentally leave the rigid frames marked for them by the Asur. It is not the only example of the control over the colleges, it's probably just a least subtle one. There exist other, much more sublime, albeit no less effective. Even language in which the human mages are supposed to formulate their spells was forced upon them, since lingua praesentia, a simplified form of Eldarin, was created for the needs of this institution. And as almost every linguist will tell you, language has influence over the way we think, and that linguistic categories limit and restrict cognitive categories. Or at least that's the Saphir-Whorf hypothesis. Anyways, in the case of wielding the winds of magic, the rule is simple. Each human mage manifests an affinity and talent for one of the 8 winds, so it's imperative to teach said mage to manipulate just this one wind. With time, they will attune themselves even more to that singular one, and it will become harder for them to even perceive the other winds, let alone control them. In any case, manipulating multiple winds is strictly forbidden by the colleges, hence in accordance with Teclis' theories, every single human mage should specialize in use of a single wind of magic. Not because humans are incapable of manipulating multiple, they are. Problem lies in the fact that such a practice is supposed to drastically increase chances for something to go wrong. The winds wouldn't be woven harmoniously, and as a result we would get Dar. Magic incredibly powerful, but magic that's tainted, chaotic, and mixed in a slapdash way. So there are good reasons for such restrictions to exist for the Imperial mages. Those still are restrictions though, and people living in this world are well aware of that fact. If they are interested in magic, because they are an acolyte in one of the colleges for example, they would probably know that elves can weave multiple winds of magic at once. But nobody will ever teach humans that art. That, naturally, causes the feeling of jealousy and envy towards the Asur to develop. Masters in the colleges are perfectly aware of the fact that young adepts of magical arts relatively often look with envy in the direction of elven mages. One of the more interesting ways of making the need of operating just one wind of magic plainly visible to students, which I found in the lore, is sending of the students asking about Kaish to the Philharmonic Orchestra. Let's say for a week. There, the acolyte is supposed to realize that the orchestra as an entity is impressive, but for its music to be possible, every single musician has to master his or her own instrument. And colleges of magic are like an orchestra. Singular mages are like musicians, and the instruments, let's say oboe or other violin, are like a skill in wielding a singular wind of magic. They aren't better or worse from other instruments, but they do need to be played in harmony for the music to happen. That lesson usually works, but sometimes it doesn't though. Here we reach the issue of circumventing the restrictions put in place by the theories of Teclis. As we already discussed, many Imperial mages, especially in the younger days, pondered on that, but very few of them decided to actually do it. Less reasonable ones bring their own doom upon themselves, like for example the members of the infamous cabal of Van Horstman, many of which were led to the treachery in the name of Tsinch by their own hubris and the need to prove that humans are in fact capable of wielding the true magic Kaish. More reasonable ones try to circumvent the restrictions without actually breaking them. About such men we know very little, since they themselves don't boast about their accomplishments, and if they get caught, they have a tendency to disappear. But we do know that they have existed, like the so-called Vizenberg 4, for example. Around the year 2365 Imperial calendar, in the docks of Vizenberg, don't ask me where exactly that is, it is possible that it should be Vizenburg in Vizenland, but somebody misspelled that. There was supposedly a group of 4 kids. Each one of them manifested magical talent, but they were said to have very broad affinity to magic, so even though the kids were found and ended up in the colleges, it wasn't very clear in which college they should be enrolled in. Finally, the Supreme Patriarch decided their fate, and the kids ended up in the Jade, Grey, Celestial and Amethyst Order, respectively. And that would have been an end of this story if not for the fact that the kids that knew each other from Vizenberg, after they became fully fledged magisters, kept together, and within their own experiments, already as an adult, started to move the boundaries of what is permitted, experimenting with combining 4 winds of magic, but in a way that each of the mages present during the incantation operated their own singular wind of magic, and only the final effect of the spell or ritual used the potency of these 4 combined winds. Sadly, the information about the experience of the Vizenburg 4 reached the colleges, which fell into panic mode, despite, or maybe exactly because of the fact, that the approach used by that 4 didn't break the rules of the colleges. Supposedly, the witch hunters have learned of them also. Vizenburg 4 disappeared, and the notes from their experiments were destroyed. Even their names are now unknown, since all the mentions of them were erased from the archives of the colleges. They couldn't destroy everything though. A page with a spell developed by them, supposedly, which was designed in such a way that it required 2 mages from different traditions, appeared at least once at an underground auction and aroused great interest. What's particularly curious is the fact that in the Winds of Magic for the 4th edition, in which we find that spell, we read that it combines wind of Giran and Gur. Please pay attention to the fact that the second one of these winds was not used by the representatives of any of the orders to which members of the Vizenberg 4 supposedly belonged to. So, either the cited above information are wrong, and they ended up in different colleges, or their cabal had more members than just the famous 4, and that the school of combining different winds of magic is still practiced somewhere in secret. For example, by the members of the organization called the Unity, which brings together Imperial mages striving to circumvent the limitations placed on humanity by the Teclisian theories, from which the focus on wielding just one wind of magic is the biggest one. For obvious reasons, members of the Unity don't brag about their membership in the organization, but rumors about its existence constantly make rounds around the halls of the colleges. Supposedly, the mages gathered in the Unity meet from time to time in different secluded places in Altdorf in order to share their discoveries. Between those meetings, they devote their time to the search of long-forgotten knowledge and ancient rituals. However, all of these are just rumors, and it's not even certain whether this organization exists at all, or whether this rumor is not, for example, just a way to draw young, naive adepts of the magical arts into one of the plentiful cults of Tzeentch. So, as we have already said, the fact that Imperial Magisters are limited to wielding a single wind of magic is not because of inherent human incapability to do so, but because in the Empire they are thought to think so. But firstly, it wasn't always like that, and secondly, the laws of the Empire apply, well, only in the Empire. A giant inspiration for every mage who would wish to break those limitations for sure will be a mage by the name of Kadon. But not Kadon the Mad, the one tied with Morkheim and the vampires, but Kadon the Shackler, one of the most powerful human mages to ever walk the old world. He owes his name to the fact that during his lifetime, he specialized in bonding of various powerful beings, and much more. He lived a long time before the founding of the Colleges of Magic in Altdorf, because his scrolls of binding were used already in the 13th century EC, and he was already a legendary figure by then. One way or the other, this Kadon traveled across the world, shackling and bending to his will a myriad of different creatures. The bigger and more challenging the monster, the more interesting it was to Kadon. Leviathans, chimeras, manticores, whatever comes to your mind, even demons. If the legends about him are to be believed, in one day he even binded 7 different drakes. Today, the spell that allows a mage to transform into a wild beast, literally, is named after him. But binding of different beings, even though that's what he's most known for, wasn't his biggest accomplishment. That was his research on the topic of controlling the energies of entire magical storms. All of that required skillful control over many winds of magic, and there is very few mages capable of repeating his accomplishments today. And all of that without spectacular side effects that accompany Dar. Even Teclis himself was once forced to admit that the magical accomplishments of Kadon were extraordinary and very uncomfortable to the elves of Ultuan. For many a mage, especially for the ones outside of the Empire, this Kadon is a role model, and there are constant efforts taken to replicate his work and accomplishments. And scrolls, marked with Kadon's sigil, which still exist today, are incredibly precious artifacts. However, Kadon was an exception, and his students, even if he really had them during his lifetime, didn't create a coherent school or magic tradition. Which cannot be said by the so-called Truthsayers of Albion, druids inhabiting the mist-covered isle that lays to the north-northwest from the Old World. Their magic traditions deviate extremely from what is practiced on the continent, and most likely the Asur wouldn't be fan of them either. All of that because they don't limit themselves to wielding a singular wind of magic. Truthsayers had much better magic teachers than Teclis was for the Imperial mages, since they were, supposedly, trained by the Old Ones themselves. Long time ago, they were taught many things about the nature of reality and magic, and the secrets are still passed on from one generation of Truthsayers to another. Paradoxically, Imperial mage that would reach the mist-covered shores of relatively primitive Albion would learn more about the geomantic web, waystones, ley lines, and the Old Ones there than in all the lectures on this topic in Altdorf combined. Assuming that they would somehow earn the trust of the Truthsayers. Sadly, due to the nature of how this knowledge is being passed on, across the millennia, large parts of it was lost and forgotten, and the Truthsayers aren't as capable as they have been in the past. Despite of that, they still masterfully wield the winds of life and beast, and they can do it basically simultaneously, since in accordance with the rules of the Warhammer Fantasy Battles, each of them, whether they specialize in Giran or Gur manipulation, can use a spell to turn into a wild creature, a spell that belongs to the domain of the Wind of the Beast. As a side note here, that's the same transformation of Kadon, which I've mentioned while talking about him. The Truthsayers have their dark reflection in the Dark Emissaries, those among the druids of Albion who with time got corrupted with the dark powers. The Dark Emissaries, among others, use a spell from the domains of Shadow and Death, so they also possess the ability to utilize at least 2 separate winds of magic. Not to mention Dar itself, but in today's episode we're not focusing on mages that are on the proverbial dark side of the Force. My focus is more on the grey areas that can, but don't have to, lead a mage to their doom. In general, all you have to do is to leave the borders of the Empire to see that there is quite a few different human magic traditions out in the world, which often use multiple winds of magic at once. Empire also had those, to mention just the tradition of elemental magic in the days before the colleges, but they become outlawed, and today mages have to be enrolled in the college to be molded in accordance with the Ecclesian spirit. It's pointless to list out all the foreign magic traditions, whose practitioners operate multiple winds of magic, sometimes even at once. But in the next few minutes I'll present, in my opinion, only the more interesting examples. I have to point out that in both cases we'll be discussing, the particular traditions of using multiple winds of magic was developed under the influence of much more powerful teachers than Theclis. First example of such we'll find just beyond the Grey Mountains in Bretonia. Truth be told, mages in this land are not particularly liked, and if it so happens that some court employs one, it's almost always a mage who got his education in the Empire. One important exclusion from that rule are the Grail Damsels, who are believed to be emissaries of the Lady of the Lake herself. And they are also probably the most powerful human magic users in the old world. Inhabitants of Bretonia don't know the details on how they are trained, for they are such an extraordinary people that they can break any and all societal norms that bind women in that land, and there is a few brave enough to ask one for details of how and where she has learned to operate the winds of magic in such a way. But we, as outside observers of the setting, know that it was in Altdorf, and they are the same girls that were taken by the fire if they sensed a magical gift in them. Such girls grow up among the Asrai, and across many years they are taught safe usage of multiple winds of magic, with special focus put on the magic of life and beast, which they can operate with great skill. Grail Damsels can wield not just those, but can also use the spells of elemental or illusionist magic. Each of them also knows cleansing spells which reassemble healing or spells of Hish in their effects. As such, Grail Damsels are a great example for the fact that skillful wielding of multiple winds of magic by humans is possible. But we shouldn't forget that they are not the rule though, they are an exception. Moreover, only the girls that have passed all the tests return to Bretonia, and those that didn't fulfill all the stringent requirements most likely serve as a fertilizer in the forest. Additionally, Altdorf is a weird place in which time can flow differently, so in reality they could have devoted magnitude more time to learning than the mages in the colleges, and still look phenomenal. Another very interesting exception are the Katayan mages called Shugengan, practicing magic arts called Yin and Yang and a combination of it called Feng Shi. Yeah, I know, Warhammer yet again shines with the creativity of naming things it borrows from other works. Either way, Katayan theory of magic differs drastically from what one can learn in Altdorf, and the differences start already in how different winds are perceived. For Katayans, there are emanations of appropriate elements, of which they distinguish 8: water, Giran, fire, Akshe, wood, Gur, metal, Chamon, stone, Azer, light, Hish, spirit, Shish, and darkness, Ulgu. The Imperial family is proficient in fluent weaving of all these winds, in practice getting the same results as the High Magic, or above mentioned Feng Shi, as it is known in the East. After all, being a dragon means that you have loads of time to learn and practice much more than just the ways of turning oneself into human form using magic. But it's precisely this transformation into a human that the aforementioned Shugengan are closely associated with. Over the millennia that the dragons have ruled Cathay, their family has had a multitude of human lovers. The Shugengan are their descendants, which means they have a certain amount of dragon blood flowing through their veins. Because of this, they often hold important positions in local courts and can also display magical talent, often greater than ordinary, and that's in quotation marks of course, Cathayan astromancers or alchemists. While these last two groups usually specialize in usage of a singular wind, namely Azir and Kamon, the Shugengan, to achieve the desired magical effects, weaves up to 4 different winds. However, these are not random winds, because the practitioners of the Yin art use Gur, Kamon, Shish and Ulgu, while the users of Yang wave together the winds of Giran, Akshi, Azir and Hish. All of that while usually avoiding magical disasters, but it's important to not forget that because of their origins, Shugengan aren't exactly entirely ordinary representatives of humanity. Cathayan astromancers, on the other hand, are very gifted but regular humans, usually without any dragon blood flowing through their veins. Perhaps the greatest testament to the capacities of some of the Cathayan astromancers is the fact that the Dragon Emperor himself has allowed those of them he most favors, even those lacking the draconic blood of the dragon-blooded, to master the use and study the Feng Shi. It is said that some of them journey for years around Katai to master each of the elemental winds under the tutelage of different Katayan dragons before finally finding their way to Weijin in order to study Feng Shi and earn the rank and title of Supreme Astromancer. Either way, this brief overview shows that in the world of Warhammer exist quite a lot of different human schools and traditions of magic that combine different winds of magic, and it doesn't always end with manifestation of Dar. I'll admit, some of this came to be thanks to the influence of particularly powerful magic teachers, but still, those schools exist, and a potentially curious mage could try to learn about them. How can we introduce these motifs in our gaming sessions? I bet dollars against walnuts that it might be even easier than it originally appears. We don't even need to leave the Empire. All we need is for the player characters to get interested in history of a region they currently are. There still should be clues and artifacts left, for example, by wizards that in the ages past practiced elemental magic, now outlawed in the Empire. Especially in the north of the Empire, where in the past mages weren't prosecuted as much as they were in the south. Truth be told, such things would also interest the witch hunters, which can lead to many interesting meetings during the campaign, but it is one of the ways to learn more about the topic of combining different winds of magic. We also don't have to look back to the past for an inspiration. To be honest, all that's needed is to find someone who's still practicing witchcraft, a practice that, while outlawed, very often works by drawing from different winds at the same time. If you are planning for a session to take place more in the corridors of the Colleges of Magic, then I think that the rumors circulating about the Vizenberg 4 or the organization called the Unity can add color to the relatively uninteresting process of career development within this institution. And of course, they have a potential to set our players on a collision course with either real organization of mages trying to obscure the limitations of the Teclesian magic theories, or some other shady organization or cult present in Altdorf, or even lead them on the top of a witch hunter's pyre. Seeking this forbidden within the Empire knowledge can also be a good pretense to start a journey into broader world. About certain places in which different magical traditions are practiced, I have just talked about, so I won't be repeating myself, but for every mage that's too curious for his own good, literally every single place outside of the Empire will be very interesting. Bretonia, Kislev, Araby, Estalia, Border Princess, all of these are places where one can find magic users that don't trouble themselves with the restrictions of the Colleges of Magic. Of course, that has both good and bad sides to it, like, for example, works of Arabian wizard Ibn Nagazar, whose grimoire contains powerful spells drawing both from the winds of Shish and Ulgu, but in order to cast them, one has to perform a bloody sacrifice. Possibilities are endless, and an Imperial Magister who's curious about the world, if he wasn't afraid to leave the boundaries of his training, could learn a great many new things. Bring in with it many dangers on his party, but ultimately our main point is to ensure that our gaming sessions are not boring. Let me know if you think it's worth experimenting with multiple winds of magic, or if the relative safety of Teclesian theories is better. If you like this material, I encourage you to subscribe to the Ratcatcher Tales channel if you haven't done so already, or leave a like if you're already with us. That's all for today, take care, and I'll see you again very soon.